All right. We are live from Occupy City Hall. If you're watching this, let me know what the audio's like. I'm hoping that the batteries are still good and fresh. Ooh. Just had me a Dunkin' iced coffee. I wanted a warm coffee, but the mobile up the street didn't have no coffee. They petty, but it's all good. We are doing our Rockford reading segment. We've been doing good about doing one of these segments once a day. And so, we've been doing good about doing one of these segments once a day. And so I think that we want to make sure we continue on our streak. So we are on chapter 8. Look at me, I got these damn gloves on. I can't even. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I got gloves on. So what? I'm trying to stay comfy early. It's windy out here tonight. We are on chapter 8, The Violence of Desperate Men, page 78. Page 78. Let's do some reading. Hold on 1 second. Let's figure out where we at. Okay. Here we go. Middle of page 78. 3 nights later, on January 30th, I left home a little before 7 to attend our Monday evening mass meeting at the First Baptist Church. A member of my congregation had come to the parsonage to keep my wife company in my absence. About 9:30, they heard a noise in front that sounded as though someone had thrown a brick. In a matter of seconds, an explosion rocked the house. A bomb had gone off on the porch. After word of the bombing reached the mass meeting, everybody attempted to keep it from me. People looked at me and then away. One or two seemed about to approach me and then changed their minds. Soon I noticed several of my fellow ministers going in and out of the church in a rather unusual manner, and from this I surmised that something had happened. Unable to restrain my curiosity any longer, I called 3 of my closest associates and urged them to tell me what had happened. I assured them that I was prepared for whatever it was. Ralph Abernathy said hesitantly, "Your house has been bombed." I asked if my wife and my baby were all right. They said, "We are checking on that now." Strangely enough, I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. My religious experience a few nights before had given me the strength to face it. I urged each person to go straight home after the meeting and adhere strictly to our philosophy of nonviolence. I admonished them not to become panicky and lose their heads. Quote, "Let us keep moving," end quote, I urged them. Quote, "with the faith that we are doing what is right and with the even greater faith that God is with us in this struggle," end quote. I was immediately driven home. As we neared the scene, I noticed hundreds of people with angry faces in front of the house. The policemen were trying, in their usual rough manner, to clear the streets, but they were ignored by the crowd. One Negro was saying to a policeman who was attempting to push him aside, quote, "I ain't gonna move nowhere. That's the trouble now. You white folks is always pushing us around. Now you got your 38 and I got mine, so let's battle it out," end quote. As I walked toward the front porch, I realized that many people were armed. Nonviolent resistance was on the verge of being transformed into violence. I rushed into the house to see if Coretta and Yoki were safe. When I walked into the bedroom and saw my wife and daughter uninjured, I drew my first full breath in many minutes. Coretta was neither bitter nor panicky. She had accepted the whole thing with unbelievable composure. As I noticed her calmness, I became more calm myself. The mayor, the police commissioner, and several white reporters had reached the house before I did and were standing in the dining room. After reassuring myself about my family's safety, I went to speak to them. Oh, this wind blowing, ain't it? Damn. Hold on. Is it messing up the mic? How y'all? It ain't. Messing up the audio, is it? It blowing like this? Hold on. Let me reposition. Let me reposition a little bit. Damn. It's blowing on us, ain't it? Okay. Alright, I got us repositioned. Let me find out. Let's find our page. Hold on. Ooh. I don't know. Did I put us further into it or better? I think that's better. Audio wise, I think that's going to be better. Man. Hold on. Damn. These elements ain't no joke, y'all. My fault. Hold on. Where was we at? Yeah, I think I need to be having my back the opposite way. All right, we going to keep it pushing. Wendy ass. Okay. I rushed into the house to see if Coretta and Yoki were safe. When I walked into the bedroom and saw my wife and daughter uninjured, I drew my first full breath in many minutes. Coretta was neither bitter nor panicky. She had accepted the whole thing with unbelievable composure. As I noticed her calmness, I became more calm myself. The mayor, the police commissioner, and several white reporters had reached the house before I did and were standing in the dining room. After reassuring myself about my family's safety, I went to speak to them. They expressed their regret that this unfortunate incident had taken place in our city. One of the trustees of my church turned to the mayor and said, quote, "You may express your regrets, but you must face the fact that your public statements created the atmosphere for this bombing. This is the end result of your get tough policy," end quote. By this time, the crowd outside was getting out of hand. The policemen had failed to disperse them, and the throngs of additional people were arriving every minute. My goodness, this wind. The white reporters were afraid to face the angry crowd. The mayor and police commissioner, though they might not have admitted it, were very pale. In this atmosphere, I walked out to the porch and asked the crowd to come to order. In less than a moment, there was complete silence. Quietly, I told them that I was all right and that my wife and baby were all right. We believe in law and order. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky at all. Don't get your weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, that is what God said. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know you love them. I did not start this boycott. I was asked by you to serve as your spokesman. I want it known the length and breadth of this land that if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. If I am stopped, our work will not stop. For what we are doing is right, what we are doing is just, and God is with us. As I finished speaking, there were shouts of "Amen" and "God bless you." I could hear voices saying, quote, "We are with you all the way, Reverend," end quote. I looked out over that vast throng of people and noticed tears on many faces. After our many friends left the house late that evening, Coretta, Yoki, and I were driven to the home of one of our church members to spend the night. I could not get to sleep. While I lay in that quiet front bedroom with the distant street lamp throwing a... Alright, this shit crazy. Alright, hold on. I gotta turn my back. Hold on, I gotta turn my back. Let me switch this around. Oh, damn, that's a close-up. Sorry. Damn. The wind blowing. Okay, so I think this should help our wind. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh shit. It's real ghetto. Okay. Oh. All right, here we go. Turn back around. Oh yeah, see, that's already better. The fall is upon us. Fall is upon us. We're going into year 2. Going into year 2. All right. All right. We are on page 80. After our many friends left the house late that evening, Coretta, Yoki, and I were driven to the home of one of our church members to spend the night. I could not get to sleep. While I lay in that quiet front bedroom with the distant street lamp throwing a reassuring glow throughout the curtained window, I began to think of the viciousness of people who would bomb my home. I could feel the anger rising when I realized that my wife and baby could have been killed. I thought about the city commissioners and all the statements that they had made about me and the Negro generally. I was once more on the verge of corroding hatred. And once more I caught myself and said, quote, "You must not allow yourself to become bitter," end quote. Midnight had long since passed. Coretta and the baby were sound asleep. I turned over in bed and fell into a dazed slumber. But the night was not yet over. Sometime later, Coretta and I were awakened by a slow, steady knocking at the front door. Through the window, we could see the dark outline of a figure on the front porch. I pulled myself out of bed, peered through the curtains, and recognized the stocking, reassuring back of Coretta's father. Obie Scott had heard the news of the bombing over the radio and had driven to Montgomery. He came in the house with an obvious sign of distress on his face. After talking with us a while, he turned and said, quote, "Coretta, I came to take you and the baby back home with me until this tension cools off," end quote. In a calm but positive manner, Coretta answered, quote, "I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't leave Martin now. I must stay here with him through this whole struggle," end quote. And so Obie Scott drove back to Marion alone. Just 2 nights later, a stick of dynamite was thrown on the lawn of E.D. Nixon. Fortunately, again, no one was hurt. Once more, a large crowd of Negroes assembled, but they did not lose control. And so nonviolence had won its first and its second test. After the bombings, many of the officers of my church and other trusted friends urged me to hire a bodyguard and armed watchmen for my house. When my father came to town, he concurred with both of those suggestions. I tried to tell them that I had no fears now and consequently needed no weapons for protection. This they would not hear. They insisted that I protect their house and family, even if I didn't want to protect myself. In order to satisfy the wishes of those close friends and associates, I decided to question the decision of an armed guard. I went down to the sheriff's office and applied for a license to carry a gun in the car, but this was refused. Meanwhile, I reconsidered. How could I serve as one of the leaders of a nonviolent movement and at the same time use weapons of violence for my personal protection? Coretta and I talked the matter over for several days and finally agreed that arms were no solution. We decided then to get rid of the one weapon we owned. We tried to satisfy our friends by having floodlights mounted around the house and hiring unarmed watchmen around the clock. I also promised that I would not travel alone around the city. I was much more afraid of Montgomery when I had a gun in my house. When I decided that I couldn't keep a gun, I came face to face with the question of death, and I dealt with it. From that point on, I no longer needed a gun, nor have I been afraid. Had we become distracted by the question of my safety, we would have lost the moral offensive and sunk to the level of our oppressors. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 8 and to the beginning of Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called Desegregation at Last. And so I want to speak about some of the things that was written about in Chapter 8 by Dr. King. I think to start, I guess I'll start off where he ended at. And I think, me personally, one of the things that early on and continuously throughout this struggle that we've been waging, one of the things I've had to contend with is the concept of death. I think in general, it was a concept that I've always struggled with or contended with in some form in my life. But I think it became something that was a much more of an immediate nature after I began to be more involved with the protests and the demonstrations that were taking place in the city and the county last year. And one of the things that stuck with me, it was multiple quotes that different people had surrounding the idea of death and the idea of being okay in some sense, or being at peace in some sense with your own mortality. And one of them was Malcolm X when he spoke about the price of freedom is death. He spoke about saying certain things with the understanding that some of those things that he was saying may have the consequence of him losing his life. And I think that when you begin to come to a place where you accept your mortality, you accept that we are all mortal creatures, that we all live and we all die, and we can do as many things as we want to try to control the manner in which we die, or control how we don't die or how long we live. But in fact, that it is something that is outside of our control. But what we can control is the type of way that we live, the type of integrity that we live with, the type of moral compass that we live with, the things that we will be remembered for once we are no longer here. And so I think that with contending with some of those things, I came to a place personally where I accepted that if the road that my life was meant for was to die in the advancement or in the struggle for justice, in the struggle for equity, in the struggle for liberty and freedom for, specifically, this is the black liberation struggle is something that's spoken about, but the liberation of all human beings, for the freedom and the ending of oppression and the ending of exploitation for all human beings. That's something that is worthy of the fight, or it's the risk for that outweighs the reward for that outweighs the risk. And so I think that in the process of getting to that place, one of the people that I've leaned upon was Dr. King. And I think that there's an extra connotation when you lean upon people like Dr. King and people like Malcolm X, people who actually not only vocalized the fact that they understood that the price of freedom and sometimes was your life, but also lived that, also exemplified that, also that manifested on them. So I think that as we end that chapter, that was one of the things that was pertinent. And I think that also we read this book earlier, but previous to this, entitled In Defense of Looting. And as we went through reading In Defense of Looting, one of the things that was a constant theme was that black people have always had the specter of violence looming over their existence in this country, looming over their existence in this society, whether that be during the Middle Passage, slavery times, Reconstruction times, or even where we are reading now in the civil rights struggles times, and then even continuing into this age of mass incarceration and police terrorism. That specter of violence still continues to hang over the head of black people, and specifically when you begin to try to struggle or fight against these means of oppression, or struggle and fight against these means of exploitation, that specter of violence becomes to manifest itself closer, or becomes bigger, or becomes a stronger presence in your existence. And so we're seeing that specter of violence as Dr. King and the people involved in this movement become more and more successful and closer to success. You begin to see that specter of violence manifest itself in their lives and materialize itself in their lives more. And I think that that's something that has to be understood as we are going through and speaking about why some of these struggles have not succeeded in the manner that we would like them to succeed. For sure. Have a good night. Take it easy. Love y'all. And why some of these things have not manifested, why some of these struggles have not been able to be fulfilled in the ways that we need them to be fulfilled, or that people have needed them to be fulfilled, is because of the fact that the violent means that have been used to put them to an end. And so we got a note here that says, death is a consequence of the freedom with which we are born. And I think that, again, that ties back into the things that Dr. King was speaking about towards the end when he dealing with his house being bombed, dealing with the threats being made against his life, dealing with being arrested and being in fear that he was going to be turned over to a Klan. He had to truthfully and genuinely contend with his mortality, and if his mortality was worth the furthering of the struggle, you know. And I think that, again, when we get into the idea of collectivism as opposed to individualism, we start to understand how if even though individually one of us having our lives threatened, or individually one of us having even our lives taken away or our freedom taken away, individually those are things that are terminal. It's individually it can be terminal, but that does not, when you are part of a collective, the collective, it's not terminal for the collective. And that's one of the things Dr. King was speaking about, is that even if he died, even if he faced something that was terminal, that the movement he was a part of would not face something that was terminal. Is the collective he was part of would not face something that was terminal. And I think that that's one of the things that strengthens you when you start to begin to think about your mortality, is that yes, we are as physical human beings, as flesh and bones, there is a mortal element to our existence, but in the efforts of being a part of history, in the efforts of being a part of movements, we can begin to grasp at immortality. We can begin to grasp at of leaving a legacy that extends past our physical existence. And I think that that's one of the things that also comes, with this idea of collectivism. And I think that that is one of the things that Dr. King, as you can see, as he's reading through this, he talked about the movement continuing past him. He's buying into the concepts of collectivism throughout this chapter. That's the, and again, as we get ready to start this next chapter, chapter 9, I believe that that is the only way to even truthfully be able to combat the violence that comes from the state when you resist these type of things in the manner that he did, is through collectivism. Individually, you can't combat it. Individually, you will understand quickly that, at any point a man can be destroyed. At any point a man can be co-opted or sold out, or a man can, a person can meet their limits. But when you begin to speak about collectives, and when the individual is not the whole, when the sum of the parts is greater than, when the sum of the parts are greater than any individual part, you get to a place where those things that can break an individual can strengthen the collective. And so that is, and so when I think about being able to survive through some of the violent things and the specter of violence that has lured over us, I think about how important collectivism has been in that. And again, one of the things we want to have a heavy emphasis on as we're doing these readings is being able to cross-reference it back to other pieces of literature that we've read, cross-reference it back to things that are happening right here locally in Rockford in 2021, and be able to articulate to our friends and neighbors and loved ones some of these things. Some of the people who maybe will never be able to have the time or the privilege or the opportunity to read through some of this literature, we figure out the things that we can take, that we can bring back to them, to articulate to them the importance of the struggle. All right, so we're on chapter 9, Desegregation at last. When the opposition discovered that violence could not block the protests, they resorted to mass arrest. As early as January 9th, a Montgomery attorney had called the attention of the press to an old state law against boycotts. On February 13th, the Montgomery County grand jury was called to determine whether Negroes who were boycotting the buses were violating this law. Hold up, y'all. We got to get this page turned. It's treacherous with these winds. After about a week of deliberations, the jury, composed of 17 whites and 1 Negro, found the boycott illegal and indicted more than 100 persons. My name, of course, was on the list. We've had some experience with these type of grand juries and indictments where myself and Ari and other members of the May 30th Alliance have had grand juries go out and have had us indicted on felonious charges. And I think that what's important to point out about that, when we are talking about highlighting the hypocrisies, is that they have had us arrested, have had us brought up on a grand jury, brought up on charges of a felonious nature. But they have not been able to, at grand juries, bring police officers up on charges. They've always come up short when it's time for them to be indicted. And one of the things, a common saying, it's in the book Just Mercy that we're reading on the IGTV that I got to get back to doing more often. But it's a common saying in the legal culture that the state's attorney can indict a ham sandwich if it wanted to. That's how easy it is to get an indictment. So that explains to you why it was so easy for them to get an indictment on these boycotts of Dr. King and the 100 people that was involved in this mass arrest. That explains why it's been so easy for them to get indictments on the grand juries from the felonious charges against us. But it also goes to, in some extent, explaining why they haven't had charges brought up on these police officers, because you understand that the state's attorney and the police department are part of the same legal mafia or government mafia that exists. They're part of the same organization or the same syndicate that exists within the state and within the counties. And so I just think that's again one of the things that's important to point out is that historically, when it comes to political arrests, they have been able to have grand juries and get indictments out on these things. Well, I don't know. I'm missing something. What's you? I think you might. I think the indict that's on there is not speaking on legal terminology. It's more speaking on yeah. All right. So we in the middle of page 84. At the time of the indictments, I was at Fisk University in Nashville giving a series of lectures. During this period, I was talking to Montgomery on the phone at least 3 times a day in order to keep abreast of developments. Thus, I heard of the indictments first in a telephone call from Ralph Abernathy late Tuesday night, February 21st. He said that the arrests were scheduled to begin the following morning. Knowing that he would be one of the first to be arrested, I assured him that I would be with him and the others in my prayers. As usual, he was unperturbed. All night long, I thought of the people in Montgomery. Would these mass arrests so frighten them that they would urge us to call off the protest? I knew how hard-pressed they had been. For more than 13 weeks, they had walked and sacrificed and worn down their cars. They had been harassed and intimidated on every hand, and now they faced arrest on top of all of this. Would they become battle-weary, I wondered? Would they give up in despair? Would this be the end of our movement? I rose early Wednesday morning and flew to Atlanta to pick up my wife and daughter, whom I had left at my parents' home while I was in Nashville. My wife, my mother, and my father met me at the airport. I had told them about the indictments over the phone, and they had gotten additional information from a radio broadcast. Coretta showed her usual composure, but my parents' face wore signs of deep perturbation. My father, so unafraid for himself, had fallen into a constant state of worry for me and my family. Many times he sat in our councils and had never shown any doubt about the justice of our actions. Yet this stern and courageous man had reached a point where he could scarcely mention the protest without tears. My mother, too, has suffered. Like all parents, she was afraid for her son and his family. After the bombing, she'd had to take to bed under doctor's orders, and she was often ill later. During this period, I piled up high, long-distance telephone call bills calling between Atlanta and Montgomery, knowing that if Mother could hear my voice on the telephone, she would be temporarily consoled. My parents' expressions, even the way they walked as they came toward me at the airport, had begun to show the strain. As we drove toward my parents' home, my father said that he thought it would be unwise for me to return to Montgomery now. Quote, although many others have been indicted, end quote, he said, quote, their main concern is to get you. They might even put you in jail without a bond, end quote. He went on to tell me that the law enforcement agencies in Montgomery have been trying to find something on my record in Atlanta that would make it possible for me to be deported from Alabama. They had gone to the Atlanta Police Department and were disappointed when they learned that I did not have even a minor police record. Quote, all of this shows, my father concluded, that they are out to get you, end quote. And this is, and again, to just, I'll cross-reference this on a personal note before we get back to this. This is similar to a conversation I had with my mother when some of the indictments were coming down from the grand juries after some things that happened at City Market, and I had left the area of downtown and had went to go do a few things, and I found out that I had a warrant out for my arrest based on something that had happened a week prior. Again, based on these are political arrests, so it's about me protesting as memorials were being torn down. I had found out that I had this a warrant. Ari had already been arrested, and we had already found out what Ari's bond was. I had a warrant put out before and had been arrested, so I was sort of guesstimating what I thought my bond would be. One of the conversations I had with my mother was her saying that I could turn myself in, but when I didn't know. We didn't know what my bond would be. We didn't know that maybe I wouldn't even be given a bond because of the fact that this is just such unprecedented situations that we're dealing with, and because of the fact that we know this isn't about trying to keep any community safer. It's about trying to deter. It was about trying to deter me from protesting. It's about trying to deter me from the stance that I have, and so they're not. This is just the move that they're doing, and so there's no really way to know what their end goal is in this move. And so again, one of the things that I think is important to point out is that so many of the things. This is in 1957, Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King, in the struggle to end segregation, that Dr. King is having this conversation with his mother and with his family. And this is 2021 in Rockford, Illinois, in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, in which these same kind of conversations are being had. And again, when we trace this back to the beginning of this book, when Dr. King had a conversation with his mother as a child about what it meant to be black in this society in 1920s, that is the same conversation that, again, I had with my mother in the end of the 90s and the early 2000s growing up black in this society, and that I've had to have with my son in the 2020s as he's growing up black in this society. And so the reason history has repeated itself so much in our society is because of the fact that we have not learned from the history, and because of the fact that we have not applied the things that some people may have learned from history to our present situations. And so that is what we are that's what we are reading these things in the hopes for. Okay. Okay. I listened to him attentively, and yet I knew that I could not follow his suggestion and stay in Atlanta. I was profoundly concerned about my parents. I was worried about their worry. These were difficult days for me. On the one hand, I had to be concerned about keeping my emotional and psychological balance. On the other hand, I was deeply concerned about my mother's worrying. But if I eased out now, I would be plagued by my own conscience, reminding me that I lacked the moral courage to stand by a cause to the end. No one can understand my conflict who has not looked into the eyes of those he loves, knowing that he has no alternative but to take a dangerous stand that leaves them tormented. I want to read that one more time. No one can understand my conflict who has not looked into the eyes of those he loves, knowing that he has no alternative but to take a dangerous stand that leaves them tormented. We continued our drive from the airport and soon arrived at my parents' house. I went directly upstairs to see my daughter, Yoki, now 3 months old. The innocence of her smile and the warmth of her affection brought temporary relief to my tension. My father asked several trusted friends to come to the house in the early afternoon to discuss the whole issue. Feeling that this exchange of ideas might help to relieve his worries, I readily agreed to stay over and talk to them. Among those who came were A.T. Walden, distinguished attorney, C.R. Yates and T.M. Alexander, both prominent businessmen, A. Scott, editor of the Atlanta Daily World, Sherman L. Green of AME Church, Benjamin Mays, president of the Morehouse College, and Rufus E. Clement, president of Atlanta University. Coretta and my mother joined us. My father explained to the group that because of his respect for their judgment, he was calling on them for advice on whether I should return to Montgomery. He gave them a brief history of the attempts that had been made to get me out of Montgomery. He admitted that the fear of what might happen to me caused him and my mother many restless nights. He concluded by saying that he had talked to a liberal white attorney a few hours earlier who had confirmed his feeling that I should not go back at this time. There were murmurs of agreement in the room, and I listened as sympathetically and objectively as I could while two of the men gave their reasons for concurring. These were my elders, leaders among my people. Their words commanded respect, but soon I could not restrain myself any longer. Quote, I must go back to Montgomery, end quote, I protested. Quote, my friends and associates are being arrested. It would be the height of cowardice for me to stay away. I would rather be in jail 10 years than desert my people now. I have begun the struggle and I can't turn back. I have reached the point of no return, end quote. In the moment of silence that followed, I heard my father break into tears. I looked at Dr. Mays, one of the great influences in my life. Perhaps he heard my unspoken plea. At any rate, he was soon defending my position strongly. Then others joined him in supporting me. They assured my father that things were not so bad as they seemed. Mr. Walden put through 2 calls on the spot to Thurgood Marshall, General Counsel of the NAACP, and Arthur Shores, NAACP Counsel in Alabama, both of whom assured him that I would have the best legal protection. In the face of all these persuasions, my father began to be reconciled to my return to Montgomery. Characteristically, my father, having withdrawn his objections to our return to Montgomery, decided to go along with us. Ralph Abernathy, released on bail after his arrest the previous day, came to the house. With Ralph and my father, I set out for the county jail, several of my church members following after. Okay, and then that brings us to a sort of like a breaking point. We're going to start another section here, but I want to just point out or speak on the monologue Dr. King gave here when he said, I have begun the struggle and I can't turn back. I have reached the point of no return. And I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind as we talk about or as we think about why we must continue not only with the occupation, but also with waging the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, with the understanding that the first step that you take in my opinion, is the first step. The first step that you take in the struggle, in my opinion, is the moment that you step into a place of no return, or is the moment that you enter the place of no return. Is the moment that you have entered the place where you can't turn back. And so on May 31st, we had entered the place of no return. We had entered a place where we could not turn back because we had initiated the struggle collectively as a community. We had initiated the struggle, and so it takes so much to get to the point of initiating the struggle that just turning back from the initiation is a betrayal in itself to the struggle and to the things that are being struggled for, the things that need to be struggled for, to the people who need that struggling. And then you also have to understand that at the moment you turn back, that will be not only will that be where the next generation has to pick it up at, but they'll have to pick it up even further from there. We should be trying to pass this off to the next generation, not allowing the next generation to have to pick it up. And I think that is something that is very distinctly different. The time that it takes the generation to have to pick up the baton, if it's dropped, could be the time that it takes for them to be able to succeed in the struggle. And often, if we keep running this metaphor of a race or a marathon out, often these things are won in milliseconds and in small amounts of time. And so if we are thinking about the fact that it could take an extra millisecond for them to pick up the baton that could have been handed to them, as opposed to having that extra couple of milliseconds to continue forward if it's being put right into their hand. It makes you understand the importance of handing it off, the importance of not allowing it to have to be picked up. And so that is one of the things that I gather from Dr. King talking about the point of no return. And so I think that that's something that we have to think there are certain key words and certain key phrases that we want to sort of begin to enter into the lexicon of the struggle that we're waging here because of the connotations they have. One of those things is the point of no return, is understanding that we are at the point of no return with some of these issues. I see. Let me see. Where are we at? Okay. Top of 87. At the jail, an almost holiday atmosphere prevailed. People had rushed down to get arrested. No one had been frightened. No one had tried to evade arrest. Many Negroes had gone voluntarily to the sheriff's office to see if their names were on the list, and were even disappointed when they were not. A once fear-ridden people had been transformed. Those who had previously trembled before the law were now proud to be arrested for the cause of freedom. With this feeling of solidarity around me, I walked with firm steps toward the rear of the jail. After I had been photographed and fingerprinted, one of my church members paid my bond and I left for home. The trial was set for March 19th. Friends from all over the country came to Montgomery to be with us during the proceedings. Judge Eugene Carter brought the court to order, and after the necessary preliminaries, the state called me up as the first defendant. For 4 days, I sat in court listening to arguments and waiting for a verdict. On Thursday afternoon, March 22nd, both sides rested. All eyes were turned toward Judge Carter, as with barely a pause, he rendered his verdict. Quote, I declare the defendant guilty of violating the state's anti-boycott law, end quote. The penalty was a fine of $500 and court costs, or 386 days at hard labor in the county of Montgomery. Then Judge Carter announced that he was giving a minimum penalty because of what I had done to prevent violence. In the cases of the other Negroes charged with the same violation, Judge Carter entered a continuance until a final appeal was complete in my case. Hold on 1 second. Man, this wind ain't no joke. The fall is upon us. We still outside though. In a few minutes, several friends had come up to sign my bond. Damn, this ain't no joke. In a few minutes, several friends had come up to sign my bond, and the lawyers had notified the judge that the case would be appealed. I left the courtroom with my wife at my side and a host of friends following. In front of the courthouse, hundreds of Negroes were waiting. As I waved my hand, they began to sing, quote, we ain't gonna ride the buses no more, end quote. Ordinarily, a person leaving a courtroom with a conviction behind him would wear a somber face, but I left with a smile. I knew that I was a convicted criminal, but I was proud of my crime. It was the crime of joining my people in a nonviolent protest against injustice. It was the crime of seeking to instill within my people a sense of dignity and self-respect. It was the crime of desiring for my people the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was above all the crime of seeking to convince my people that non-cooperation with evil is just as much a moral duty as cooperation with good. So ended another effort to halt the protest. I had faith that as the case was appealed and went up through the higher courts, the decision would be reversed. Instead of stopping the movement, the opposition's tactics had only served to give it greater momentum and to draw us closer together. On that cloudy afternoon in March, Judge Carter had convicted more than Martin Luther King Jr., case number 7399. He had convicted every Negro in Montgomery. It is no wonder that the movement couldn't be stopped. It was too large to be stopped. Its links were too well bound together in a powerfully effective chain. There is amazing power in unity. Where there is true unity, every effort to disunite only serves to strengthen the unity. What the opposition failed to see was that our mutual sufferings have wrapped us all in a single garment of destiny. What happened to one happened to all. And then I think that's one of the things that, and again, this is we're adding things into the lexicon as we're trying to add collectivism into our lexicon when it comes to this struggle. So should we add and this is why at the beginning of the lives I say that every act of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice is directly and indirectly connected to every other act of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and that each one of us as community members are connected by these acts of racial injustice, police terrorism, and mass incarceration, is because once we understand that what happens to the one happens to the all, we begin to get power when things happen to one of us. We begin to, because that is what it is. When a police officer or the state, or even if this is just if we're speaking about a racial injustice issue, when somebody is oppressing or exploiting, they are exerting the power that they believe they have because of the status quo in the society, or the power that they have because of the status quo in the society. But once they exert that power, we also have the option as members of this community to respond back to that exertion of power, to counter that exertion of power. But that counter can only come through collective action. That counter will never be able to adequately come through individual action. When an institution does something to an individual, they do it with the understanding that they can overpower and overcome that individual. But if we can take that power and leverage that they have exerted onto the individual and respond collectively, we can turn that power back onto the institution. And so that is, so we are wrapped in a garment of a destiny with each other, because the only way for my child to be protected from having something happen to them in the future is by me fighting for what has presently happened to your child. The only way to protect me from having an injustice happening to me in the future is by fighting for the current injustice that has already happened to you. And so, and without caring about, again, your character or your personal life. What happens to the least of us happens to all of us. We should want justice for the least of us. If you are a person who sees things in this nature, and again, we have to get to a place of furthering our dialogue from even believing in the concept of it being the least of us. But again, we sort of speak into where we are at with some of these things. And so, let me see. Page 88. There we go. 88. Segregation must. Okay. Page 88, middle of page 88. The members of the opposition had also revealed that they did not know the Negroes with whom they were dealing. They thought they were dealing with the group who could be cajoled or forced to do whatever the white man wanted them to do. They were not aware that they were dealing with Negroes who had been freed from fear, and so every move they made proved to be a mistake. It cannot be otherwise because their methods were geared toward the old Negro, and they were dealing with the new Negro. I have always felt that ultimately, along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it. My great prayer is always for God to save me from the paralysis of crippling fear, because I think when a person lives with the fears of the consequences for his personal life, he can never do anything in terms of lifting the whole of humanity and solving many of the social problems which we confront in every age and every generation. In this crisis, the members of my church were always nearby to lend their encouragement and active support. As I gradually lost my role as husband and father, having to be away from the home for hours and sometimes days at a time, women came into the house to keep Coretta company. Many of the men took turns as watchmen. My day-to-day contact with my parishioners had almost ceased. I had become no more than a Sunday preacher. But my church willingly shared me with the community and threw their considerable resources of time and money into the struggle. White friends, too, came forward with their support. Often they called to say an encouraging word, and when the house was bombed, several of them, known and unknown to us, came by to express their regret. Through all of these trying and difficult days, Coretta remained amazingly calm and even tempered. In the midst of the most tragic experiences, she never became panicky or over-emotional. She was always strong and courageous. While she had certain natural fears and anxieties concerning my welfare, she never allowed them to hamper my active participation in the movement. And she seemed to have no fear for herself. She was always a deep consolation to me and supported my every move. Occasionally, I would send Coretta and Yoki to Atlanta to stay with my parents or to Marion to stay with hers in order to give them some relief from the heat of the struggle. However, she was never satisfied being away from me. She always insisted on coming back and staying with the struggle to the end. I am convinced that if I had not had a wife with the fortitude, strength, and calmness of Coretta, I could not have stood up amid the ordeals and tensions surrounding the Montgomery movement. In the darkest moments, she always brought the light of hope. Let's not fool ourselves. We haven't reached the promised land, north or south. Oh, and I should point out, this is a speech. This is an excerpt from a speech. Let's not fool ourselves. We haven't reached the promised land, north or south. We still confront segregation in the South in its glaring and conspicuous forms. We still confront it in the North in its subtle and hidden forms. Segregation is still a fact. Now, it might be true that old man segregation is on its deathbed, but history has proven that social systems have a great last-minute breathing power, and the guardians of the status quo are always on hand with their oxygen tents to keep the old order alive. But if democracy is to live, segregation must die. The underlying philosophy of democracy is diametrically opposed to the underlying philosophy of segregation, and the dialectics of the logicians cannot make them lie down together. Segregation isn't evil. Segregation is a cancer in the body politic which must be removed before our democratic health can be realized. There was a time that we attempted to live with segregation. There were those who felt that we could live by a doctrine of separate but equal, and so back in 1896, the Supreme Court of this nation, through the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, established the doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land. But we all know what happened as a result of that doctrine. There was always a strict enforcement of the separate without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. And so as a result of the old Plessy doctrine, we ended up being plunged across the abyss of exploitation, where we experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. But even if it had been possible to provide the Negro with equal facilities in terms of external construction and quantitative distribution, we would have still confronted inequality. If it had been possible to give Negro children the same number of schools proportionately and the same type of buildings as white children, the Negro children would have still confronted inequality in the sense that they would not have had the opportunity of communicating with all children. You see, equality is not only a matter of mathematics and geometry, but it's a matter of psychology. It's not only quantitative something, it is not only a quantitative something, but it is a qualitative something. And it is possible to have the quantitative equality and qualitative inequality. The doctrine of separate but equal can never be. I experienced this the other day. I left Montgomery, Alabama Thursday morning, September 27th, via Eastern Airlines en route to Virginia. In Atlanta, I changed from Eastern to Capital Airlines. Just as we were about to take off, we discovered that we had generator trouble, which necessitated our deplaning and going back in the waiting room. We were to have lunch on the flight, and so while we were waiting, they gave us all tickets to go into the Dobbs House in Atlanta Airport and have lunch. I was the only Negro passenger on the plane, and I followed everybody else going into the Dobbs House to get lunch. When I got there, one of the waiters ushered me back, and I thought they were giving me a very nice, comfortable seat with everybody else, and I discovered they were leading me to a compartment in the back. And this compartment was around you. You were completely closed in, cut off from everybody else, so I immediately said that I couldn't afford to eat there. I went on back and took a seat out in the main dining room with everybody else, and I waited there, and nobody served me. I waited a long time. Everybody else was being served. So finally I asked for the manager, and he came out and started talking, and I told him the situation, and he talked in very sympathetic terms. and I never will forget what he said to me. He said, quote, "Now, Reverend, this is the law. This is the state law and the city ordinance, and we have to do it. We can't serve you out here, but now everything is the same. Everything is equal back there. You will get the same food. You will be served out the same dishes and everything else. And you will get the same service as everybody out here." End quote. And I looked at him and started wondering if he really believed that. And I started talking with him. I said, quote, "I don't see how I can get the same service. Number one, I confront aesthetic inequality. I can't see all these beautiful pictures that you have around the walls here. We don't have them back there. But not only that, I just don't like sitting back there, and it does something to me. It makes me almost angry. I know that I shouldn't get angry. I know that I shouldn't become bitter. But when you put me back there, something happens to my soul, so that I confront inequality in the sense that I have a greater potential for the accumulation of bitterness because you put me back there. And then not only that, I met a young man from Mobile who was my seatmate, a white fellow from Mobile, Alabama, and we were discussing some very interesting things. And when we got in the dining room, if we follow what you're saying, we would have to be separated. And this means that I can't communicate with this young man. I'm completely cut off from communication. So I confront inequality on 3 levels. I confront aesthetic inequality. I confront inequality on the sense of a greater potential for the accumulation of bitterness. And I confront inequality in the sense that I can't communicate with the person who is my seatmate. And I came to see what the Supreme Court meant when they came out saying that separate facilities are inherently unequal. There is no such thing as separate but equal. Excuse me. Okay, let's continue. On the top of page 92. The battle was not yet won. We would have to walk and sacrifice for several more months while the city appealed the case. But at least we could walk with new hope. Oh, hold on. Did I miss a page? Okay. But at least we could walk with new hope. Now it was only a matter of time. The summer days gave way to the shorter, cooler days of an Alabama autumn. The Supreme Court decision on our appeal was still pending. Meanwhile, we were facing continued attempts to block the carpool. Insurance agents decided, almost overnight, to refuse to insure our station wagons, contending that the risk was too high. Finally, the company that held our liability insurance notified us that all the policies would be canceled as of September 15th. A northern friend who had read our trouble wrote suggesting that we contact Lloyd's of London. A few days later, I talked to T.M. Alexander, an insurance broker in Atlanta, who approved of the idea and agreed to make the contact for us. In a few days, he was able to tell us that Lloyd's of London would take the insurance. But we were in for even greater difficulties. The city decided to take legal action against the carpool itself. We tried to block this maneuver by filing a request in the federal court for an order restraining the city from interfering with the pool. But U.S. District Judge Frank M. Johnson refused to grant the request. Soon, several of us received subpoenas. The city had filed the petition. The hearing was set for Tuesday, November 13th. The night before the hearing, I had to go before the mass meeting to warn the people that the carpool would probably be enjoined. I knew that they had been willingly suffering for nearly 12 months, but how could they function at all with the carpool destroyed? And if we asked them to walk back and forth every day to their jobs, could they? And if not, will we then be forced to admit that the protests have failed in the end? For the first time in our long struggle together, I almost shrank from appearing before them. Ooh, this joint ain't no joke, man. I got my back to it in the interest of trying to keep the integrity of the mic up. I got my back to it, but ain't no joke. It ain't no joke. Okay. The evening came, and I mustered up enough courage to tell them the truth. I tried, however, to end on a note of hope. Quote, This may well be, end quote, I said, quote, the darkest hour just before dawn. We have moved all of these months with the daring faith that God was with us in our struggle. The many experiences of days gone by have vindicated that faith in the most unexpected manner. We must go out with the same faith, the same conviction. We must believe that a way will be made out of no way, end quote. But in spite of these words, I could feel the cold breeze of pessimism passing through the audience.
Hey man, I don't mean to interrupt.
What's up, my man?
You like caprese salad? I don't eat this stuff left over.
Oh, man, yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Have a good night. Okay. Well, nothing came and I must have enough courage. This may be Tuesday morning. I'll do it for the cloud of uncertainty. Okay. Top of page 93. Tuesday morning found us in court, once again before Judge Carter. The city's petition was directed against the MIA and several churches and individuals. It asked the court to grant the city compensation for damages growing out of the carpool operation. As chief defendant, I sat at the front table with the prosecuting and defense attorneys. Around 12 o'clock, during a brief recess, I noticed unusual commotion in the courtroom. Both Commissioner Sellers and Mayor Gale were called to a back room, followed by two of the city attorneys. Several reporters moved excitedly in and out of the courtroom. I turned to my attorneys, Fred Gray and Peter Hall, and said, quote, something is wrong, end quote. Before I could fully get these words out, Rex Thomas, a reporter for Associated Press, came up to me with a paper in his hand. Quote, here is the decision that you have been waiting for. Read this release, end quote. Quickly, with a mixture of anxiety and hope, I read these words. Quote, the United States Supreme Court today affirmed the decision of a special three-judge U.S. District Court in declaring Alabama's state and local laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional. The Supreme Court acted without listening to any argument. It simply said, quote, the motion to affirm is granted and the judgment is affirmed, end quote. At this moment, my heart began to throb with an inexpressible joy. At once, I told the news to the attorneys at the table. Then I rushed to the back of the room to tell my wife, Ralph Abernathy, and E.D. Nixon. Soon the word had spread to the whole courtroom. The faces of the Negroes showed that they had heard. Quote, God Almighty has spoken from Washington, D.C., end quote, said one joyful bystander. After a few minutes, Judge Carter called the court to order again, and we settled down to the case at hand for the remainder of the day. About 5 o'clock, both sides rested, and the judge's decision came in a matter of minutes. As we had all expected, the city was granted a temporary injunction to halt the mortar pool, but the decision was an anticlimax. Tuesday, November 13th, 1956, will always remain an important and ironic date in the history of the Montgomery bus protest. On that day, two historic decisions were rendered. One to do away with the pool, the other to remove the underlying conditions that made it necessary. The darkest hour of our struggle had become the hour of victory. Disappointment, sorrow, and despair are born at midnight, but morning follows. And I think from a morale standpoint that it's important for us to remember this story, to remember that it was when they were at what seemed to be the certain edge of defeat that triumph rang through for them in the movement that was taking place in Montgomery and in the movement that was beginning to take place in Alabama. And now it's important for us to always put our triumphs in perspective, that we are dealing with great institutional evils, great institutional corruptions. And so one win does not mean that we have defeated those things. So we cannot become complacent, but we must be able to understand when we begin to, whether we are beginning to take a step forward or we have taken a step forward, so that way we can be able to analyze what things need to be done to further that progress. And again, so that way from a psychological standpoint, from a mental standpoint, emotional standpoint, to remind ourselves that we are not constantly being defeated, that we are not constantly losing, that there are triumphs, that there are victories, that there are wins, and to be able to articulate them is important. I rushed home and notified the press that I was calling the Negro citizens together on Wednesday night, November 14th, to decide whether to call off the protest. In order to accommodate as many people as possible, 2 simultaneous meetings were scheduled, one on each side of town, with the speakers traveling from one meeting to the other. In the meantime, the executive board decided, on the advice of counsel, to recommend that the official protest be ended immediately, but that the return to the buses be delayed until the mandatory order arrived from the Supreme Court in Washington. It was expected in a few days. The 8,000 men and women who crowded in and around the churches were in high spirits. At the first meeting, it was clear that the news of the decision had spread fast. Each of the meetings accepted the recommendations of the executive board to call off the protest, but refrained from riding the buses until the mandate reached Alabama. It was a glorious daybreak to end a long night of enforced segregation. That night, the Ku Klux Klan rode. The radio had announced their plan to demonstrate throughout the Negro community, and threats of violence and new bombings were in the air. For a short period during the late summer and early fall, there had been a decline in harassments, but they started again when the Supreme Court rendered its verdict. The evening after the decision, my telephone rang almost every 5 minutes. One caller said to me, quote, "If you allow the niggers to go back to the buses and sit on the front seat, we are going to burn down more than 50 nigger houses in one night, including yours," end quote. I said to him very calmly that that wasn't the way to solve the problem. Before I could complete my sentence, he said, quote, "Shut up your mouth, nigger, or we will come out there and blow you right up now," end quote. Another caller spent his time cursing the Supreme Court. He told me that he had evidence that all the Supreme Court justices were communists. He closed his bitter statement by saying, quote, "We are just waiting for that damn Hugo Black to come back to Alabama, and we are going to hang you and him on the same tree," end quote. Ordinarily, threats of Klan action were a signal to the Negroes to go into their houses, close the doors, pull the shades, or turn off the lights. Fearing death, they played dead. But this time, they had prepared a surprise. When the Klan arrived, according to the newspapers, quote, about 40 carloads of robed and hooded members, end quote, porch lights were on and doors open. As the Klan drove by, the Negroes behaved as though they were watching a circus parade. Concealing the effort it cost them, many walked about as usual. Some simply watched from their steps. A few waved at the passing cars. After a few blocks, the Klan, nonplussed, turned off into a side street and disappeared into the night. Meanwhile, we went to work to prepare the people for integrated buses. In mass meeting after mass meeting, we stressed nonviolence. The prevailing theme was that, quote, "We must not take this as a victory over the white man, but as a victory for justice and democracy," end quote. We hammered away at the point that, quote, "We must not go back on the buses and push people around unnecessarily, boasting of our rights. We must simply sit where there is a vacant seat," end quote. In spite of all our efforts to prepare the Negroes for integrated buses, not a single white group would take the responsibility of preparing the white community. We tried to get the White Ministerial Alliance to make a simple statement calling for courtesy and Christian brotherhood, but in spite of the favorable response of a few ministers, the majority, quote, "dare not get involved in such a controversial issue," end quote. This was a deep disappointment. And then, so I think that one of the things I want to point out in this section too, before we read on to the further into the next section of this chapter, is how the mind state of the community has changed. The mind state of the people in Montgomery, the black people in Montgomery, has changed, and how that has been part of the changing of the climate and the changing of the consciousness. Is Dr. King spoke about how once the black people in the community would have went into their houses and hid, and once, because of the fear of death from the Klan, they would have played dead to try to avoid anything happening to them from the Klan. But because of the fact that they had been staring down these issues and staring down death and staring down their mortality in the midst of this struggle, they had gotten into a place where the Klan could no longer scare them. They had gotten into a place where the threat of death or the threat of physical violence was no longer something that would scare them. And again, that gets you back to the ideas of individualism versus collectivism. And because, and I'm sure individually there were, as Dr. King says, some people, went about trying to conceal their fear, their emotion. Individually, I'm sure multiple people, if not every person involved, had a fear of death or a fear of some type of physical violence happening to them. But because of the strength that they had collectively in waging this struggle or this fight against it, they were able to have a united front that deterred the Klan and probably kept people alive. The fact that they had this united front, instead of allowing a few of them to, instead of allowing themselves to be divided because of fear, because they allowed themselves to become united in it, it probably kept them alive. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to get to the place of, as well, as we are altering and understand that that's what happens with the altering of the consciousness. That's what happens with the altering of the type of mindset and the culture that goes on in the community with our people, is that the things that these institutions have once used as a form of repression can then be used against them as a form of uniting, which again is essentially what Dr. King is pointing out and stating here. So let's finish at the bottom of page 95. On December 20th, 1956, the bus integration order finally reached Montgomery. A mass meeting was immediately scheduled for that evening to give the people final instructions before returning to the buses the following day. I called and asked the manager of the bus company to be sure to have service restored on all of the major lines. With evident relief, he agreed. To the overflow crowd at the St. John AME Church, I read the following message that I had carefully prepared in the afternoon. This is the message. These 12 months have not at all been easy. Our feet have often been tired. We have struggled against tremendous odds to maintain alternative transportation. There have been moments when roaring waters of disappointment poured upon us in staggering torrents. We can remember days when unfavorable court decisions came upon us like tidal waves, leaving us treading in the deep and confused waters of despair. But amid all of this, we have kept going with the faith that as we struggle, God struggles with us, and that the arc of the moral universe, although long, the arc of the moral universe, although long, is bending toward justice. We have lived under the agony and the darkness of Good Friday with the conviction that one day the heightening glow of Easter would emerge on the horizon. We have seen truth crucified and goodness buried, but we have kept going with the conviction that truth crushed to the earth will rise again. Now our faith seems to be vindicated. This morning, the long-awaited mandate from the United States Supreme Court concerning bus segregation came to Montgomery. Our experience and growth during this past year of united nonviolent protests has been of such that we cannot be satisfied with a court, quote, victory, end quote, over our white brothers. We must respond to the decision with an understanding of those who have oppressed us and with an appreciation of the new adjustments that the court order poses for them. We must be able to face up honestly to our own shortcomings. We must act in such a way as to make possible a coming together of white people and colored people on the basis of a real harmony of interest and understanding. We seek an integration based on mutual respect. This is the time that we must evince calm dignity and wise restraint. Emotions must not run wild. Violence must not come from any of us, for if we become victimized with violent intents, we will have walked in vain, and our 12 months of glorious dignity will be transformed into an eve of gloomy catastrophe. As we go back to the buses, let us be loving enough to turn an enemy into a friend. We must now move from protest to reconciliation. It is my firm conviction that God is working in Montgomery. Let all men of goodwill, both Negro and white, continue to work with him. With this dedication, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and injustice. The audience stood and cheered loudly. This was the moment toward which they had pressed for more than a year. The return to the buses, on an integrated basis, was a new beginning. But it was a conclusion, too. The end of an effort that had drawn Montgomery's Negroes together as never before. It had been gratifying to know how the idea of nonviolence had gradually seeped into the hearts and souls of the people. There had been an amazing amount of discipline on the part of our people. I felt that the whole struggle had given the Negro a new sense of dignity and destiny. To many of those present, the joy was not unmixed. Some perhaps feared what might happen when they began to ride the buses again the next day. Others have found a spiritual strength in the sacrifice to a cause. Now the sacrifice was no longer necessary. Like many consummations, this one left a slight aftertaste of sadness. I had decided that after many months of struggling with my people for the goal of justice, I should not sit back and watch, but should lead them back to the buses myself. I asked Ralph Abernathy, E.D. Nixon, and Glenn Smiley to join me in riding the buses on the first integrated buses. They reached my house around 5:45 on Friday morning. Television cameras, photographers, and news reporters were hovering outside the door. At 5:55, we walked toward the bus stop. 5:55. Oh, they reached me. Okay. At 5:55, we walked toward the bus stop, the cameras shooting, the reporters bombarding us with questions. Soon the bus appeared. The door opened, and I stepped on. The bus driver greeted me with a cordial smile. As I put my fare in the box, he said, quote, "I believe you are Reverend King, aren't you?" End quote. I answered, quote, "Yes, I am," end quote. Quote, "We are glad to have you this morning," end quote, he said. I thanked him and took my seat, smiling now too. Abernathy, Nixon, and Smiley followed, with several reporters and television men behind them. Glenn Smiley sat next to me. So I rode the first integrated bus in Montgomery with the white minister and a native southerner as my seatmate. Downtown, we transferred to one of the buses that serviced the white residential section. As the white people boarded, many took seats as if nothing were going on. Others looked amazed to see Negroes sitting in front, and some appeared peeved to know that they had to either sit behind Negroes or stand. One elderly man stood up by the conductor, despite the fact that there were several vacant seats in the rear. When someone suggested to him that he sit in the back, he responded, quote, "I would rather die and go to hell than sit behind a nigger," end quote. A white woman unknowingly took a seat by a Negro. When she noticed her neighbor, she jumped up and said in a tone of obvious anger, quote, "What are these niggers going to do next?" End quote. And then I think one of the things I want to point out there before we let me finish this section here. I'll finish with last paragraph. But despite such signs of hostility, there were no major incidents on the first day. Many of the whites responded to the new system calmly. Several deliberately and with friendly smiles took seats beside Negroes. True, one Negro woman was slapped by a white man as she alighted, but she refused to retaliate. Later she said, quote, "I could have broken that little fellow's neck all by myself, but I left the mass meeting last night determined to do what Reverend King asked," end quote. The Montgomery Advertiser reported at the end of the first day, quote, "The calm but cautious acceptance of this significant change in Montgomery's way of life came without any major disturbance," end quote. And then, okay, so I think it's a few things that I want to point out there. And I want to base them all on some of the specific experiences that people had when they went back to the buses. And so I think that one of the things that has and I think this goes to show the type of just the deep level of violence that black people and even tracing it all the way back to the first set of Africans that came over here and then dealt with chattel slavery, the deep type of violence that they dealt with, and the psychological, even the psychological violence that was put upon them, where the victim always feels the need to have the moral high ground opposed to the victimizer. And I think that's almost in an effort to remind so that people don't forget who the victim is. I think it's this, the idea of growing up, people always say, you never get caught throwing the first punch. It's always the person who throws the second punch who gets caught. And so often it's the philosophy of not wanting to be caught throwing the second punch, or not wanting the second punch that you threw in defense to be misconstrued with the first punch that was thrown in violence, or the first punch that was thrown in aggression. And I think that there have been gains that we have been able to have as a society from that type of mindset. But I do think that it is a mindset that we have to adjust and alter because of the method of the type of issues that we're facing and dealing with, and because that these institutions have sort of co-opted this moral high ground that Dr. King was standing on. One of the things that Dr. King said at the time when he was using nonviolence resistance is that he believed it was revolutionary to be hit and to not hit back because of the type of society that existed at the time, and that revolutionary thought process, or that revolutionary philosophy that he was speaking on, has been co-opted by some of these institutions now, and they have used the idea of defending yourself from being hit as almost wrong, or defending yourself from violence as wrong, to try to point to Dr. King as or to point to some of these philosophies as why you should not be defending yourself, or why you should not retaliate in a certain way. And so, like, when we speak about the woman who was on the bus who was slapped by the white man, are there some pros that exist from her not hitting this white man back, or not assaulting this white man back, or retaliating in a physical nature? Of course there is. She could have been lynched and killed after doing it. She could have been imprisoned and jailed after doing it. And so she tried to preserve her physical well-being. She tried to preserve her freedom. And then also she said that because of the words she heard from Dr. King, and she wanted to preserve the integrity of the movement. But I think that one of the other things that we have to have a conversation about and a dialogue about is that there are also pros to her responding in defense of herself in that situation. There's also pros to her, the same reason it was pros for Dr. King and the people in this movement making the stance of being willing to die for not riding the buses. There's pros to this woman being willing to die or suffer imprisonment for her to not be physically assaulted by this white man, or for this white man to not think that upon physically assaulting her that he can psychologically assault her, and that as a black person you're constantly walking around as a possible victim. And as time has passed, this is a mindset that has changed, and I think that it has changed a lot because of how many people stopped allowing that to happen. But I think that there still has to be a conversation about the fact that her responding in self-defense to a violent act of this white man would not be wrong on her part. And it would not the moral high ground of the movement would not be lost from that. And then I think another one of the things is they talked about how one of the white men said he'd rather die and go to hell than sit behind a nigger. And then and so we have to understand that this book is not gonna make it. We're gonna have to get another copy of this one. Oh damn. That there are certain people who are so embedded in white supremacy, white supremacist thought, white nationalist thought, and racist thought, and even police terrorist thought pattern, and mass incarceration thought pattern, that they will never be able to see the quote unquote promised land. It's just similar to the story I don't know in I think it's Deuteronomy. I don't know which book. One is in book in the first 5 books of the Bible. One of the books in the Torah. they speak about, I know everybody got their different religious and spiritual beliefs, but just to draw cross reference, they spoke about Moses wandering in the desert after freeing the slaves from freeing the Hebrews from Pharaoh. They wandered in the desert, and God said that it was a generation of men of war who had to die out before they could go further. And that's something that is true for every moment in time, for every movement in time, that there are just a generation of people who are so bought into the evils of that time or the evils of that society that will not change their ways. And the only way for them to be, for their influence to be eradicated from the society is through them dying and through them dying out. And so that is something that has always been present and will always be present. That it will be certain people who are so embedded in these things that the only thing that will eradicate the influence they have on the society is through them dying. And so that is one of the examples that I feel like points out to me. That's one of the things I think about when I see something like that pointed out. And then the white woman who says, what are these niggas going to do next, after she sat down and seen a black person was sitting next to her. And that is also a mindset of white people, and also people that are in anybody that is in the oppressive class or in the dominant class or dominant caste. They're all, and this traces back to what Dr. King spoke about, that oppression is never freely oppressors never freely give up their privilege, and people with privilege never freely give up their privilege. And so one of the things that you will constantly see with certain people is whenever you take a step forward, they will feel like whatever that step is, that's enough. You could be 50 steps behind them and you take one step forward to be at 49, and they'll feel like that's enough. You don't need to go any further. And then when you do take a step forward to get to 48, they'll feel like this idea of what do you want next? And so again, that has been a constant, and it doesn't matter which time that you exist in. There's these different mindsets, these different type of racist ideology, white supremacist ideology mindsets. The mindset of they'll die before they accept anything being changed. Then this mindset of how much more do you want? Don't you have enough? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or just work in your community to make yourself better. Why do you need to sit next to white people? Or you free from slavery. Why do you need to be able to have equal employment or have equal housing? Or why can't you just be happy with separate but equal? And so those are both two mindsets that are very real and still exist. And so we at the end of this chapter, so let's rock through the end of this. Montgomery marked the first flash of organized, sustained, mass action and nonviolent revolt against the Southern way of life. In Montgomery, there emerged courageous and collective challenge In Montgomery, there emerged courageous and collective challenge to and protests against the American order, which promised so much for all while perpetuating indignities and brutalities on the oppressed minority. Montgomery marked the psychological turning point for the American Negro in his struggle against segregation. The revolution birthed in Montgomery is unlike the isolated, futile, and violent slave revolts. It was also unlike the many sporadic incidents of revolt against segregation by individuals resting in their own way the forces of oppression pinning them down, resisting in their own way the forces of oppression pinning them down. In Montgomery, all across the board, at one and the same time, the rank and file rose up and revolted by refusing to ride the buses. By walking instead, and by brilliant use of carpools and improvising, the boycotters sustained their revolt all the way to victory. Also, Montgomery contributed a new weapon to the Negro Revolution. This was the social tool of nonviolent resistance. It was a weapon first applied on the American scene and in a collective way in Montgomery. In that city too, it was honed well for future use. It was effective in that it had a way of disarming the opponent. It exposed his moral defenses. It weakened his morale, and at the same time it worked on his conscience. It also provided a method for Negroes to struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. Thus, it provided a creative force through which men could channel their discontent. Ultimately, victory in Montgomery came with the United States Supreme Court's decision. However, in a real sense, the victory had already come to the boycotters, who had proven to themselves, the community, and the world that Negroes could join in concert and sustain collective action against segregation, carrying it through until the desired objective was reached. In conclusion, then, Montgomery gave forth, for all the world to see, a courageous new Negro. He emerged, etched in sharpest relief, a person whom whites had to confront and even grudgingly respect, and one whom Negroes admired and, then, emulated. He had thrust off his stagnant passivity and deadening complacency and emerged with a new sense of dignity and destiny. The Montgomery Negro had acquired a new sense of somebodyness and self-respect and had a new determination to achieve freedom and human dignity no matter what the cost. All right, we got our book falling apart here. That gets us to chapter 10, Expanding the Struggle. And that gets us to page 100. We on page 100. And so chapter 9 sort of talked about the finishing up of, or the victorious end of the struggle that went on in Montgomery. But it's important again to note that that was a struggle to end the segregation in transportation. That was not an end to all segregation. That was not a finality. That was true. In truth, that was the very beginning. That was the first seeds being planted of the struggle that would continue throughout the end of the 50s and through the majority of the 60s. Again, a lot of people marked the beginning of the civil rights movement in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, and marked the end of it in 1968 with the bill that was passed after the assassination of Dr. King. And so that is really that's exactly what we're reading through right now is Dr. King's perspective of the civil rights struggle, or the civil rights struggle at the vantage point in which Dr. King was involved in it. But I think that one of the things that Dr. King has done an excellent job of throughout this entire book is pointing out the importance of collectivism, is pointing out the importance of the people that have been around him, whether it was when he was pointing out the importance of his father and his mother and his upbringing, the importance of his wife and his children, and the strength that he attained from them, or as the movement went on and he points out the strength that he gained from members of the community involved in the movement, from other organizers involved in the movement. And so I think that even though this is an autobiography of an individual, throughout this autobiography of an individual, the importance of collectivism is being stated. And so I want to keep reading, but I don't know how the audio is sounding on these batteries. Is it anybody that's listening to this? Is it a buzz? It's not no buzz in the back of this, is it? I don't think it's no buzz. It should be. I think we good. I think we can keep on going. It's this is one of my we on like 20% battery. I think we get like to 10% battery. I'll stop it so I can charge the phone up. But I'm trying to think. What was I was going to say? Okay, so this is one of the sounds good. Okay, this is one of the book. Thank you. This is one of the books that I constantly go back to read for a balancing. Thank you. One of the books I constantly go back and read for sort of a balancing. And this, as we come up here on a year, one of the things that I'm trying to get myself prepared for is to start adding different elements into some of the things that we're doing down here to psychologically get myself in a place of trying to be present here more. I think one of the things that the spring and the summer allows, and that having some of the events at Food Truck Tuesday and the events at City Market allow is less of an onus on or less of attention is on us outside of City Hall, I guess in some type of a sense, because there's other events that are going on, and so the issues are heightened or highlighted in places other than just our presence at City Hall, even though we have continued our presence there. And so as we get to the winter and as we get to some of the colder days, it becomes for me personally more important to be out here as often as possible, as regularly as possible. I also want to get to a place of doing the lives regularly and releasing the consistency, getting into a place of more consistency. And I think that that's a step, a progress or a step forward that I'm in the process of trying to make. And in the process of doing those, of doing a lot of reevaluating and soul searching. And Dr. King has always been somebody that I've been able to revert to or to look to for affirmation or reaffirmation in doing those things, whether it be listening to the Letter from Birmingham speech during city markets when arrests were taking place and I was nervous about being arrested again or going to jail again, or whether it be after getting out of jail and going and listening to Dr. King's speeches or being inside of jail and recalling things that he said in his speeches. And so as we get ready to come up on a year of being outside of the occupation for City Hall, I felt that it feels important. It feels important for me personally to read through these things, and I'm getting a lot of personal growth and from all of these, from reading through all of these things as well. And I think that as we speak about specifically Montgomery, which the bus boycott lasted for a little bit over a year, I think that that's one of the things that some of the things he spoke about the things that they went through in the year of the Montgomery bus boycott and the gains that they made in the year of the Montgomery bus boycott, the changing of the type of mindset that he's seen happening to the people in the community as that year went on. I think we can see those same things happening here, those same things occurring here. And so I think that those are all reasons to continue forward. Those is all reasons to keep pushing. So as we continue to push forward with the occupation. Okay, we're on chapter 10, expanding the expanding struggle, excuse me. On January 9th, 1957, Ralph Abernathy and I went to Atlanta to prepare for a meeting of Negro leaders that I had called for the following day. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by a telephone call from Ralph's wife, Juanita. I knew that only some new disaster would make her rouse at us 2 in the morning. When Ralph came back, good looking. When Ralph came back, his sober face told part of the story. Quote, "My home has been bombed," end quote, he said. Quote, "and 3 or 4 other explosions have been heard in the city, but Juanita does not know where yet," end quote. I asked about Juanita and their daughter. Quote, "Thank God they are safe," end quote. Before we could talk anymore, the telephone rang a second time. It was Juanita again, saying that the First Baptist Church had been hit. Ralph's home and his church had been bombed in one night. I knew no words to comfort him. There in the early morning hours, we prayed to God together, asking for the power of endurance, the strength to carry on. Ralph and I arranged to fly back, leaving the meeting of Southern leaders to begin without us. From the Montgomery airport, we drove directly to Ralph's house. The street was roped off, and hundreds of people stood staring at the ruins. The front porch had been almost completely destroyed, and things inside the house were scattered from top to bottom. Juanita, though shocked and pale, was fairly composed. The rest of the morning was spent in a grim tour of the other bombings. The Bell Street and the Mount Olive Baptist churches had been almost completely destroyed. The other 2 churches were less severely damaged, but nevertheless faced great losses. And that's one of the, and I want to just point this out again, and even though it's a reoccurring theme, the specter of violence that lingers over these people. The specter of violence that lingers over black people and people of color in their existence in this society. And I think that one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is the type of generational trauma that does, and the way that makes people more prone to violence. You know, I think that's one of the things that doesn't get talked about when as we read through in defense of looting. I think one of the things that you can sort of see is you can see how even by the time we get to the civil uprisings and just reading through the book of In Defense of Looting, and you go through slavery, you go through Reconstruction, you go through the violence that's in slavery, the violence in Reconstruction, the violence that was in the Civil Rights Movement, and you get to a place where these are generations of people who are dealing with the specter of violence, where a child sees this violence being done to their father or their mother, and then that child goes on to live a life, and then they deal with violence being done to them, and their child experiences or witnesses these things, and then you get to a place in my belief where there are people who are born with the mindset that they're more and I don't want to phrase this in the wrong way. I don't want things to be reframed or whatever. But when you think about the type of violence that exists in inner city communities, when you realize that the beginnings of those violence were people coming outside of those communities and inflicting violence in those communities, and that type of violence continues to perpetuate. Dr. King talked about one of the issues he had with Separate But Equal was that they moved him from sitting with everybody else in the lobby of the airport to eat and put him in a secluded area. And one of the three forms of degradation that he felt he was experiencing, one of the forms of it was this degradation that led him to be bitter quicker, that led him to be angry quicker. And he said that he understands that he shouldn't get bitter and he shouldn't get angry, but being secluded and not being able to see the art that was in the gallery, or not being in the airport, or not being able to talk to the people that he had been talking to, all of those things made him begin to be bitter. And so when you think about these communities that have dealt with that segregation, and that being marginalized from the city and marginalized from resources, and then when you think about their great grandparents dealing with whatever violence came with slavery and whatever violence came with Reconstruction, and then them leaving the South because of the violence and living in the Midwest or the North or the West, and then the violence that comes with people in white communities coming into these black communities and inflicting violence. And then you think about the police violence that begins to exist in these communities. You understand why these communities now exist with violent turmoil internally without it needing to be a constant external source coming there to perpetuate it, because the external source has perpetuated and created it to such an extent that it goes on by itself. And that's not to say that there aren't still external sources coming in and perpetuating them at a high rate as well, but it gives you an answer to why there is so much internal turmoil in some of these communities. And so this is one of the things that I think that is important to always point out as we're going through and talking about the violence that is the violence that lingers and that manifests itself in these struggles and in these communities, is that there are results from this violence happening. This is somebody's child and grandchild seeing these things happening to this church, or seeing these things happen to the place that they're growing up. And a lot of times and 9 times out of 10, they can't go and inflict the violence back onto the people who have done it to them. And so it gets to a place where you then internalize that violence on the people closest to you. And that's something that's commonly seen. Okay. The rest of the morning was spent okay. That afternoon, I returned to Atlanta to make at least an appearance at the meeting of Negro leaders. There I found an enthusiastic group of almost 100 men from all over the South, committed to the idea of a Southern movement to implement the Supreme Court's decision against bus segregation through nonviolent means. We wired President Dwight D. Eisenhower, asking him to come to the South immediately to make a major speech in a major Southern city, urging all Southerners to accept and to abide by the Supreme Court's decision as the law of the land. We further urged him to use the weight of his great office to point out to the South the moral nature of the problems posed at home and abroad by the unsolved civil rights issue. Before adjourning, they voted to form the Southern Southern Leaders Conference, later the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SELC, a permanent organization to facilitate coordinated action of local protest groups. I became the group's president, a position I still hold. And then this is something that was spoken about in defense of looting, and that is the importance of when an uprising happens, of building upon that uprising, of organizing upon that uprising. They were speaking. They spoke a lot of times about some of the civil uprisings and how in Oakland it was a civil uprising that led to that was the foundation of the creation of the Black Panthers. It was they spoke about civil uprisings that happened in Watts, excuse me. But they spoke about civil uprisings that happened in Detroit being the foundation and the bedrock of a labor movement that began to be created in Detroit. And so that is the same thing that is happening in Montgomery, is that they've taken this uprising that people have in the city, and they have used that uprising. What's up? You got this? Oh, yeah. They've taken that civil uprising and created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so the same thing has happened here. When May 30th took place, May 30th became the foundation of the May 30th Alliance. It became the foundation of the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And so it wasn't an uprising that happened without some type of building being upon it. That foundation didn't get laid out, and then nothing got built upon the foundation. And so that's important for us going forward to understand that the same thing happened in Ferguson. There was a foundation that was laid by those people who went out and participated in that uprising, and then structuring must be built upon that foundation. When I returned to Montgomery over the weekend, I found the Negro community in low spirits. After the bombings, the city commission had ordered all buses off the streets, and it now appeared that the city fathers would use this reign of violence as an excuse to cancel the bus company's franchise. Hold on one second. Book falling apart. As a result, many were coming to feel that all our gains had been lost. I myself started to fear that we were in for another long struggle to get bus service renewed. I was also beginning to wonder whether the virulent leaflets that were bombarding the Negro community might be having their effect. Discouraged and still revolted by the bombings, for some strange reason I began to feel a personal sense of guilt for everything that was happening. In this mood, I went to the mass meeting on Monday night. There, for the first time, I broke down in public. I had invited the audience to join me in prayer, and had begun by asking God's guidance and direction in all our activities. Then, in the grip of an emotion I could not control, I said, Lord, I hope no one will have to die as a result of our struggle for freedom in Montgomery. Certainly I don't want to die. But if anyone has to die, let it be me, end quote. The audience was in an uproar. Shouts and cries of no, no, came from all sides. So intense was the reaction that I could not go on with my prayer. Two of my fellow ministers came to the pulpit and suggested I take a seat. For a few minutes, I stood with their arms around me, unable to move. Finally, with the help of my friends, I sat down. It was this scene that caused the press to report mistakenly that I had collapsed. Unexpectedly, this episode brought me great relief. Many people came up to me after the meeting, and many called the following day to assure me that we were all together until the end. For the next few days, the city was fairly quiet. Bus service was soon resumed, though still on the daytime schedule only. Then another wave of terror hit. Early in the morning of January 28th, the People's Service Station and cab stand was bombed, and another bomb fell at the home of a 60-year-old Negro hospital worker. The same morning, an unexploded bomb, crudely assembled from 12 sticks of dynamite, was found still smoldering on my porch. I was staying with friends on the other side of town, and Coretta and Yoki were in Atlanta. So once more I heard the news first on the telephone. On my way home, I visited the other scenes of disaster nearby and found to my relief that no one had been hurt. At home, I addressed the crowd from my porch, where the mark of the bomb was clear. Quote, "We must not return violence under any condition. I know this is difficult advice to follow, especially since we have been the victims of no less than 10 bombings. But this is the way of Christ. It is the way of the cross. We must somehow believe that unheard suffering is redemptive. We must somehow believe that unearned suffering is redemptive. End quote. Then, since it was Sunday morning, I urged the people to go home and get ready for church. Gradually, they dispersed. And then, again, I think one of the things that I want to, that I think has to be, and this is part of what having a critical conversation and having a dialogue about something. I think one of the things that it is that has to be brought up is the fact that it is not, again, it's not upon the person being victimized to always have the moral high ground. And of course, there are pros that come with this philosophy of having the moral high ground. And what up? And I'm not trying to point out, I'm not trying to take the time to tear down the concept of having the moral high ground by not returning violence with violence, because I do believe that violence begets violence, and that cycle of violence, that cycles of violence, at some point someone has to not return violence in order for that to end, in order for us to change our society. But I think it's dangerous to convolute violence with self-defense, or convolute violence with protection. And so there's an argument to be made that if there is a fear that bombings are going to continue to happen until somebody reacts or has a response to the bombings, and that is not a violence in itself, that is a form of protection, that is a form of self-defense, that is a form of being on the defensive. And Dr. King is talking about 10 bombings happening, and you're seeing how there are bombing after bombing is taking place, to the point where Dr. King his home's been bombed twice at this moment. And so There is again, and this is we're talking about a time that has passed, but with the understanding that forms of repression will continue to, and this is vigilantism that is happening as well. That I think it's important to point out, that even though it's very likely that the same vigilantes are also part of the police department, these specific acts are acts of vigilantism, and so I think that that nonviolent resistance is something that is an important philosophy, and is a useful philosophy and a useful tactic in waging the struggle that we are in. But I think that just as important as it is for us to be able to partake in nonviolent resistance and articulate the purposes of nonviolent resistance, it's important for us to take the time to try to understand people who, in the midst of nonviolent resistance happening, find ways to, or will believe to, be not non-violent in their resistance as well, and to understand the reasonings that they may want to pose a philosophy of not non-violence, and being able to, once understand those things, to also articulate how the society is the one to blame for people who may have a philosophy of not non-violence when it comes to resisting against some of these things. And then also what with that is, again, the conversation of what consists of violence. With these bombings, the community came to see that Montgomery was fast being plunged into anarchy. Finally, the city began to investigate in earnest. Rewards of $4,000 were offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the bombers. On January 31st, the Negro community was surprised to hear that 7 white men had been arrested in connection with the bombings. The defense attorney spent 2 days attempting to prove the innocence of their clients, arguing that the bombings had been carried out by the MIA in order to inspire new outside donations for their dwindling treasury. At the end of the second day, I was called to the witness stand by the defense. For more than an hour, I was questioned on things which had no relevance to the bombing case. The lawyers lifted statements of mine out of context to give the impression that I was a perpetrator of hate and violence. And then I think, and I hate to interject in the midst of a paragraph, in the midst of a section, but I think that that's one of the things that we have to also do. We have to have a full understanding of the things Dr. King and the dealt with, and the things that the SCLC and the people in the nonviolent movement dealt with. And one of the things that they dealt with was, and this is why it's important for us to be able to have a critical conversation and a dialogue about nonviolent resistance philosophy and not nonviolence resistant philosophy, is because they were making Dr. King out to be a perpetrator of hate and violence. And that wasn't something that was only being done by this lawyer at this time, but that was something that was being done by the government, city and local government, and by federal government as well. It was being done by police departments. It was being done by state's attorneys, by newspapers and magazines. This man who was emphasizing nonviolence was being painted as the perpetrator of violence, was being this man who was emphasizing love and using love as a cornerstone of his movement, was being perpetrated as someone as a hate monger, or someone who was dealing in hate and hate speech. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why we have to be able to articulate the counter argument to some of these things, because of the fact that even people who stand in the midst of nonviolence, because it is not truly about, because that's the other part of this, is that it is not truly about violence or nonviolence or not nonviolence. It is not truly about the philosophy or the tactics. It is about the philosophy. It's about the ideology. It is the fact that he was struggling against corruption and struggling against injustice, struggling against oppression and exploitation. And no matter what tactics he took to struggle against those things, they were going to try to find a way to paint him as the villain, to criminalize him and stigmatize him. And so I think that's one of the things that's important to point out. At many points, they invented derogatory statements concerning white people and attributed them to me. The men had signed confessions, but in spite of all the evidence, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Justice had once more been miscarried, but the diehards had made their last stand. The disturbances ceased abruptly. Desegregation on the buses proceeded smoothly. In a few weeks, transportation was back to normal, and people of both races rode together wherever they pleased. The skies did not fall when integrated buses finally traveled the streets of Montgomery. After Time magazine published a cover story on our movement in February 1957, I thought I observed a lessening of tensions and feelings against me in the movement itself. During this period, I could hardly go into any city or any town in this nation where I was not lavished with hospitality by people of all races and of all creeds. I could hardly go anywhere to speak in this nation where hundreds and thousands of people were not turned away because of lack of space. And then after speaking, I often had to be rushed out to get away from the crowd rushing for autographs. I could hardly walk the street in any city of this nation where I was not confronted with people running up the street, quote, "Isn't this Reverend King of Alabama?" end quote. And living under this, it was easy to feel that I was something special. When you are aware that you are a symbol, it causes you to search your soul constantly, to go through this job of self-analysis, to see if you live up to the high and noble principles that people surround you with, and to try at all times to keep the gulf between the public self and the private self at a minimum. One of the prayers that I prayed to God every day was, quote, "Oh God, help me to see myself in my true perspective. Help me, oh God, to see that I'm just a symbol of a movement. Help me to see that I'm the victim of what the Germans call a zeitgeist, and that something was getting ready to happen in history, and that a boycott would have taken place in Montgomery, Alabama if I had never come to Alabama. Help me to realize that I'm where I am because of the forces of history and because of the 50,000 Negroes of Alabama who will never get their names in the papers and in the headlines. Oh God, help me to see that where I stand today, I stand because others helped me to stand there, and because the forces of history projected me there." And I think that's a perfect place for us to end off in. That's, again, Dr. King pointing out the importance of collectivism. Again, Dr. King pointing out the importance of the individual coming secondly to the collective, secondly to the community. Again, Dr. King speaking about how he was just a symbol for the movement. And when we understand that as individuals, that all we can be is symbols for the movement, not the movement itself. And that's what we should aspire to be, is symbols for the movement and not being the movement itself. So that way, if something is ever done to imprison the symbol, or something is ever done to in an attempt to murder the symbol, that it can't imprison the movement, that it can't murder the movement. And so that's one of the things that I've also myself I constantly remind myself is that there may be people who know me when I go into places, or know me when they see me at City Hall, or see me in the streets of Rockford, and that may at times may convolute my relation to the movement, or my relation to to what is going on. But I constantly remind myself that it is because of that what's going on in Rockford was going to go on whether I was here or not. What happened on May 30th was going to happen without me being here or not. The May 30th Alliance, all of these things were going to happen without me being here or not. It's just that I am the individual that happened to be in that position to play that role. It is countless people who contributed to this movement happening, who names will never be in the papers, who pictures will never be on the papers, who may never give speeches or have press conferences, or do lives, or do readings. What's up? Do readings and be known, but their commitment and their contribution is just as important as the commitment and the contribution that I have. I equate it to movies or TV shows. There are some people who watch movies and TV shows. Their favorite character is the main character, or the person that's on the poster, or the person that everybody knows. But there's other people who watch those movies and TV shows. Their favorite character is the character that only pop up twice through the season, or only pop up for 10-15 minutes in the movie. But they're it's the importance that they play in the continuing of the storyline. It's the importance that they play in the continuing of the arc of the story. And so we all have those roles to play. And so I think that, again, this is the perfect place to end off on. My battery's getting ready to die here. So I'm going to end this by I want to remind people on October 3rd, we will be having an event out here for the 1-year anniversary of the occupation in City Hall. So please come out to that. We'll start at 3 o'clock, but you can come out anytime throughout the day. We'll have more pamphlets down here, and we'll be giving tours of the Say Their Name Square. So let's end this with saying justice for Mikey Guzman, justice for Lil Mike Sago, justice for Joseph McCormick, justice for Eddie Patterson, justice for Faustin Guaitigo, justice for Shannon Graves, justice for Philip Johnson, justice for Jasper Banks, justice for Suzette Babler, justice for Jovan Fresco, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Geno Washington. We outside.